You know that moment when you're falling asleep and your thoughts start doing something weird? When the grocery list you were mentally rehearsing suddenly transforms into a conversation with a melting clock, and somehow this makes perfect sense until you jolt awake. That strange, slippery territory between waking and dreaming is where surrealism lives. And for a movement that flourished in the early 20th century, it's never really left us, has it? Every time an advertisement shows you a car driving through clouds, or a music video features someone crying diamonds, surrealism is still doing its work. But let's start at the beginning, or at least at one possible beginning. Because surrealism was never really interested in beginnings or endings in the traditional sense. It was interested in what's underneath, what's behind, what's buried in the basement of your mind. Imagine living through the absolute carnage of the First World War. Imagine watching an entire generation of young men march off to fight in what was supposed to be a noble cause, only to have them come back broken, traumatized, or not come back at all. Imagine witnessing humanity's incredible capacity for rationality, science, and progress being used to create ever more efficient ways to kill each other. The machine guns, the poison gas, the trenches that turned into mass graves. This is the world that gave birth to surrealism, and you can understand why a group of artists and writers might look around and think, well, clearly rationality isn't all it's cracked up to be. Clearly the conscious, ordered, civilized mind that everyone's so proud of has led us somewhere pretty dark. Maybe, just maybe, the problem isn't that we're too irrational. Maybe the problem is that we're not honest enough about the irrational parts of ourselves. The surrealists weren't the first to notice this, of course. Sigmund Freud had already been poking around in people's psyches, suggesting that beneath the polite surface of the conscious mind was this roiling ocean of desires, fears, memories, and instincts that we couldn't even access directly. The unconscious, he called it. And the surrealists read his work and thought, yes, that's it. That's where the truth lives. But in dreams, in slips of the tongue, in the strange associations that pop into your head when you're not paying attention. So they set out to make art that would bypass the rational mind entirely. Art that would tap directly into that unconscious realm, where a lobster can be a telephone. And that makes more sense than any regular telephone ever did. One of the first techniques the surrealists developed was something they called automatism, which is such a perfectly surrealist word, isn't it? It sounds both mechanical and mystical at the same time. The idea was beautifully simple and impossibly difficult. Try to create without thinking. Write without planning. Draw without directing your hand. Let the unconscious mind do the driving, while the conscious mind sits in the back seat, confused but along for the ride. Picture yourself sitting down with a blank piece of paper and a pen. Now try to write continuously for 10 minutes, without stopping, without thinking about what you're writing, without censoring or directing the words. Just let your hand move and see what comes out. If you've ever tried this, you know it's harder than it sounds. That little editor in your head, the one who's always fixing your grammar and making sure you sound smart, doesn't want to shut up. It wants to be in control. But the surrealists were interested in what happens when you fire that editor, at least temporarily. What emerges from automatic writing or drawing is often strange, sometimes nonsensical, occasionally disturbing, and every now and then absolutely electrifying. Because without the conscious mind getting in the way, associations form that would never make it past the rational filter. Images collide that would normally be kept in separate mental compartments, and sometimes in that collision, something true emerges, something that couldn't have been said in any other way. The beautiful irony here is that in trying to be more irrational, the surrealists were following a very rigorous method. They were deadly serious about not being serious. They practiced spontaneity with the discipline of monks. But surrealism wasn't just about technique. It was about a whole way of seeing the world, a way of recognizing what they called the marvelous in everyday life. The surrealists believed that the world we think of as normal and rational is actually shot through with cracks, with moments where the strange bleeds through. You just have to know how to look. Think about it. Haven't you ever been walking down a familiar street when suddenly something catches your eye? A peculiar shadow, an odd reflection in a window, an overheard fragment of conversation. And for just a moment, the ordinary world seems to shimmer and reveal something else beneath it. That's what the Surrealists were trying to capture and amplify. They believed these moments weren't aberrations or mistakes in the fabric of reality. They were glimpses of a deeper reality, one that's always there but usually hidden by the mundane routines of daily life. This is why Surrealist paintings often take perfectly ordinary objects and put them in impossible situations. A pipe that's not a pipe. An apple that fills an entire room. Ants crawling across a hand. The objects themselves aren't fantastical. They're things you might see any day. But the context, the juxtaposition, the relationship between things, that's where the Surrealism lives. It's like the Surrealists figured out that you don't need to invent monsters when you can just put a shoe where a head should be. The familiar made unfamiliar is somehow more unsettling, more revealing than pure fantasy ever could be. And this is something worth sitting with for a moment, because it tells us something important about how Surrealism works on us as viewers. When you look at a completely fantastical image, a dragon or a unicorn, your brain knows immediately that it's fiction. You file it away in the not real category and move on. But when you see something that's almost recognizable, that uses the vocabulary of the real world but arranges it in impossible ways, your brain gets confused. It tries to make sense of it, fails, tries again. And in that gap between recognition and comprehension, something happens. You're forced to question what you think you know about reality. Dreams were absolutely central to the Surrealist project. And when you think about it, dreams are the original Surrealist artworks. In dreams, you're the creator and the audience simultaneously. In dreams, your dead grandmother can be giving you advice about your taxes while you're both swimming through the walls of your childhood home. And it all makes perfect sense until you wake up. The Surrealists were fascinated by this dream logic. The way dreams have their own internal consistency that doesn't match waking rationality, but isn't exactly random either. In a dream, one thing can transform into another without explanation. You can be in two places at once. Time can loop or skip or run backward. And yet there's often a strange emotional coherence to dreams. A feeling tone that persists even when the events make no sense. So Surrealist artists tried to bring that dream logic into their work. Not by literally painting their dreams, though some did that too, but by creating that same feeling of slippage, where categories blur and fixed identities become fluid. A woman's body might merge with a landscape. A face might multiply or fragment. Objects might behave like living things, and living things might become objects. There's something deeply subversive about this, you know? We're taught from childhood to put things in categories. This is a person, this is an animal, this is an object. This is real, this is imaginary. This is possible, this is impossible. And most of the time, those categories are useful. They help us navigate the world. But they're also a kind of prison. They limit what we can imagine, what we can think, what we can be. The Surrealists were interested in breaking down those categories, but to reveal that reality is stranger, more flexible, more full of possibility than we usually allow ourselves to imagine. When you see a painting where a woman's torso opens up to reveal a landscape inside, it's not just a weird image. It's asking you to consider whether the boundaries between inside and outside, between self and world, between human and nature, are as solid as you think they are. There's a concept in psychology and aesthetics called the uncanny, and it's absolutely essential for understanding Surrealism. The uncanny is that feeling you get when something is familiar and unfamiliar at the same time. It's the feeling of encountering something that seems almost right but is just slightly off in a way you can't quite put your finger on. Think about wax figures in a museum, or those incredibly realistic dolls, or even just seeing someone you know in an unexpected context where they don't quite fit. There's something unsettling about it, right? It's not fear exactly, more like a kind of cognitive vertigo. Your brain is receiving mixed signals. This thing looks alive but isn't. This person is familiar but somehow also a stranger. This situation is ordinary, but something about it is deeply wrong. Surrealism deliberately cultivates this feeling. It creates images that are uncanny by design. A landscape that's also a face. Furniture that's also body parts. Everyday objects presented in ways that make them suddenly alien and threatening. And the effect is powerful because it taps into something primal in us, some ancient survival instinct that says, pay attention. Something here is not what it seems. But the surrealists weren't trying to scare us, or at least not just to scare us. They were trying to wake us up, to shake us out of our assumptions about what's real and what's possible. The uncanny feeling is uncomfortable, yes, but it's also a sign that your mind is being pushed beyond its usual boundaries. It's a sign that you're seeing something you couldn't see before.
And here's where surrealism gets really interesting, because it suggests that the uncanny isn't just an artistic effect, it's a feature of reality itself.
The surrealists believed that if you look closely enough at anything, if you really see it without the filter of habit and expectation, it becomes uncanny. A hand, for instance, seems perfectly ordinary until you really stare at it and realize it's this weird collection of bones and flesh and skin, capable of such delicate movements, attached to your body but also somehow separate from you. The familiar, looked at long enough, becomes strange. Let's talk about bodies for a moment, because surrealism is absolutely obsessed with the human body, but not in any straightforward way. Surrealist art is full of bodies that are fragmented, distorted, transformed, merged with objects or landscapes, made impossible in various ways. And this isn't just shock value, though there's certainly some of that going on. It's about something deeper.
The human body is where we're most certain about what's real.
My body is me, right? It's the most fundamental, undeniable fact of my existence. I am this flesh, these bones, this particular arrangement of matter. And yet, the body is also deeply weird when you think about it. It's both subject and object. It's me, but I can also observe it, treat it as a thing separate from my consciousness. It betrays me constantly, getting sick, aging, refusing to do what I want it to do. And there's all this stuff happening inside it, these automatic processes that keep me alive, that I have no conscious control over.
The surrealists understood that the body is actually a perfect site for exploring the relationship between consciousness and materiality, between self and other, between what we can control and what controls us. So you get paintings where bodies are fragmented and reassembled in impossible ways, where they're turned into objects or merged with objects, where they're multiplied or hollowed out or made transparent. And a lot of this imagery is disturbing, let's be honest. There's something violent about a lot of surrealist depictions of the body, especially female bodies, which were often objectified and distorted in ways that are hard to look at today. The movement had a serious problem with gender politics, with women often cast as muses or objects of fascination rather than as full creative agents in their own right. Though some women artists did fight their way into the movement and created remarkable work that challenged these assumptions, often by turning the surrealist lens back on questions of female experience and desire. But even acknowledging those problematic aspects,
there's something in the surrealist treatment of the body that still resonates. Maybe because we're living in a time when the body feels increasingly unstable, when we're thinking hard about gender fluidity, about prosthetics and enhancements, about the relationship between physical bodies and digital selves. The surrealists were asking questions about embodiment that we're still grappling with.
Here's something that might surprise you. The surrealists thought of themselves as revolutionaries, not just in art, but in politics. They believed that liberating the unconscious mind was fundamentally a political act, that it was connected to the liberation of people from oppressive social structures. The logic went something like this: capitalist society, bourgeois morality, religious authority. All these forces work by repressing our true desires and instincts, by making us channel our energy into socially acceptable forms. Work, consume, obey, don't question, don't dream too much, stay in your lane. The conscious, rational mind that society values so highly is actually a tool of control, a way of keeping people domesticated and compliant. But the unconscious mind doesn't follow society's rules. In dreams, you can do anything. In the unconscious, there's no shame, no censorship, no hierarchy. Desires that would be forbidden in waking life can express themselves freely. So by tapping into the unconscious, by giving it a voice through art, the Surrealists believed they were striking a blow against oppression itself. Now you might think this sounds a bit naive, and honestly in some ways it was. It's not clear that painting melting clocks is actually going to overthrow capitalism, no matter how sincere your revolutionary intentions. But there's something in this idea that's worth taking seriously. The Surrealists understood that control over people isn't just physical or economic, it's also psychological. It happens through shaping how we think, what we desire, what we believe is possible. An art that disrupts those patterns of thinking, that opens up space for different ways of seeing and being, that is political, even if it's not political in an obvious, direct way. Some Surrealists took this further than others, getting involved in actual revolutionary politics, usually of the communist variety. Though those relationships were often fraught because the Surrealists' commitment to freedom and irrationality didn't always mesh well with the Communist Party's need for discipline and ideological purity. Turns out revolution has its own forms of control, and the unconscious mind doesn't take orders very well, even from the proletariat. Let's get weird for a minute and talk about what might be the most surrealist technique ever devised: the paranoid critical method. This was the brainchild of one particular artist, who shall remain mostly nameless because we're focusing on ideas here. But let's just say he was known for his elaborate moustache and even more elaborate ego. The basic idea is this: use systematic paranoia as a creative tool. Deliberately cultivate a state of mind where you see connections, patterns, and meanings everywhere, even where they might not exist. Look at a cloud and see a face. Look at a rock formation and see a figure. Look at one painting and see multiple different images depending on how you focus your attention. This sounds like madness, and in a way it is, but it's controlled madness. It's paranoia that you can turn on and off. The method works because paranoia is actually a kind of hyper-interpretation. The paranoid mind is desperately trying to make sense of things, to find patterns, to see the hidden connections. And while this can be destructive when it's a genuine mental illness, when it's used as a creative technique, it can generate astonishing insights and images. Because here's the thing, reality is actually full of patterns and connections. We're surrounded by ambiguous information that can be interpreted in multiple ways. That cloud really could look like a face if you tilt your head right. That stain on the wall really might resemble a landscape. Most of the time, we ignore these possibilities. We see what we expect to see, what we've been taught to see. But what if you deliberately paid attention to all those other possibilities? What if you took your fleeting impressions and paranoid interpretations seriously? The paranoid critical method produces images that are endlessly ambiguous, where the same painted surface can reveal multiple different scenes, depending on how you look at it. And there's something profound in that multiplicity. It suggests that reality itself is ambiguous, that there's no single correct way to see things. It gives the viewer an active role in creating meaning, rather than just passively receiving it. And okay, yes, this particular artist took it way too far and became pretty insufferable about it, but the core insight remains valuable. Paranoia, controlled and directed, can be a tool for seeing things that are actually there but usually overlooked. It's a way of taking your mind's tendency to find patterns and using it creatively rather than letting it use you. Sometimes the best surrealist techniques are the ones that sound like party games, and the exquisite corpse is a perfect example. Here's how it works. One person draws a section of a figure on a piece of paper, folds it over so only the edges are visible, and passes it to the next person, who adds their own section without seeing what came before, and so on. The result is a collaborative drawing of a creature that no single person planned or imagined. It's called the exquisite corpse because of a phrase that came up in an early version of the game, played with words. The exquisite corpse shall drink the new wine. Which tells you everything you need to know about the surrealist's sense of humour and their love of the randomly poetic. But beneath the playfulness, there's something serious going on here. The exquisite corpse is a way of creating that's genuinely collective and unconscious. No one person is in control. No one knows what the final result will be. The artwork emerges from the collaboration itself, from the chance juxtapositions and unexpected combinations that arise when multiple, unconscious minds interact without the mediating influence of conscious planning. This gets at something fundamental about Surrealism's relationship to authorship and creativity. We tend to think of art as the expression of an individual vision, a single consciousness making deliberate choices. But Surrealism asks, what if some of the best art comes from relinquishing that control? What if creativity is actually more about opening yourself up to unexpected influences and combinations than about imposing your will on the material? The exquisite corpse also creates these wonderful monster creatures that couldn't exist any other way. They have the body of a lion, the head of a teapot, the legs of a ballerina, or some other impossible combination. And these creatures are hilarious and disturbing in equal measure. They embody the surrealist fascination with transformation and mutation, with the idea that identity isn't fixed, but can be endlessly recombined and reimagined. Let's talk about surrealist objects for a moment, because some of the most memorable surrealist works aren't paintings at all. They're actual three-dimensional objects. Sculptures, if you want to call them that. But that word doesn't quite capture their strangeness. Take a teacup lined with fur, for instance, or a lobster telephone, or an iron with nails sticking out of its flat surface. These are real objects, things you could hold in your hand, but they've been altered or combined in ways that make them impossible to use for their intended purpose. They become almost aggressive in their uselessness, challenging you to figure out what they're for, what they mean, what you're supposed to do with them. These surrealist objects work on a visceral level in a way that paintings sometimes don't. When you see a painting of an impossible thing, there's still a frame around it, a clear boundary between the artwork and reality. But a surrealist object exists in the same physical space as you. It has weight and texture. You could theoretically pick it up, though you probably wouldn't want to. The impossibility is right there in your world, not safely contained on a canvas. And that fur-lined teacup, that's operating on multiple levels simultaneously. There's the obvious sexual innuendo, because the surrealists never met an innuendo they didn't like. But there's also something deeper. A teacup is meant to be this civilized object, right? It's for tea parties and polite society. Lining it with fur makes it animal, bodily, slightly disgusting. It takes an object of refinement and culture and reminds you that we're all animals underneath, that the body and its desires can't be fully domesticated, no matter how many tea parties we have. The surrealist objects also play with our expectations about materials and functions. We expect metal to be hard, fabric to be soft, food to be edible, furniture to be sittable. When those expectations are violated, when you encounter a soft watch or a rock-hard piece of bread, your brain hiccups. The object becomes uncanny, and in that moment of cognitive confusion, you're forced to recognize that your relationship to objects, to the material world, is based on assumptions that can be questioned. Desire is absolutely central to surrealism, but not in any simple or straightforward way. The surrealists believe that capitalist society works by channeling desire into safe, controllable forms. You desire consumer goods. You desire success within established hierarchies. You desire socially approved relationships. Your real desires, the strange, inconvenient, socially unacceptable ones, those are supposed to be repressed, pushed down into the unconscious where they can't cause trouble. But the unconscious doesn't give up that easily. Those repressed desires leak out in dreams, in slips of the tongue, in symptoms and neuroses. And the surrealists wanted to give those desires a voice, to let them speak without censorship, to acknowledge that we want strange things, contradictory things, impossible things. This is where surrealism can get uncomfortable, because desire isn't always pretty or politically correct. The surrealists explored sexual desire in pretty explicit ways, though often coded in symbolism. They were interested in the erotic potential of objects, in fetishism, in the ways desire can fix itself on the strangest things. And yes, a lot of this was filtered through a particularly male gaze, with female bodies often treated as objects of desire rather than subjects with desires of their own. But at its best, Surrealism's exploration of desire is about acknowledging the full range of human wanting in all its complexity and weirdness. It's about refusing to be ashamed of what you want, even if what you want doesn't make sense or isn't respectable. It's about recognizing that desire is creative, that it drives us to imagine things that don't yet exist, to transform the world to match our dreams. And there's something profoundly human in that. We are creatures who want more than we have, who imagine more than exists, who are never fully satisfied with reality as it is. Surrealism takes that fundamental human dissatisfaction with the actual and turns it into art. One of the most distinctive features of Surrealist painting is the way it treats landscape. Often you'll see these vast, empty spaces, desert-like plains stretching to infinity, or strange architectural spaces that don't follow normal rules of perspective or physics. These aren't real places you could visit. They're internal landscapes, maps of psychological states rather than geographical locations. These empty spaces create a sense of isolation and disorientation. When you look at one of these paintings, you don't know where you are or where you could go. There are no landmarks, no sense of scale, no obvious way forward or back. It's the feeling of being lost inside your own head, which is a surprisingly common human experience when you think about it. And then within these empty spaces, you'll often find isolated objects or figures. A drawer-filled torso standing alone on a plain, a giant apple in an empty room. These elements are disconnected from any narrative context. They just exist, inscrutable and somehow meaningful in their very lack of obvious meaning. This approach to space is so different from traditional landscape painting, where the goal was to capture the beauty or majesty of nature, to give you a pleasant scene you could imagine yourself walking into. Surrealist landscapes aren't welcoming. They're not picturesque. They're more like stages for psychological dramas, or perhaps psychological dramas themselves, where the landscape is the drama. What these paintings capture is the way the mind actually works when you're really paying attention to it. Thoughts don't arrive in neat, logical sequences. They pop up randomly. They're disconnected. One minute you're thinking about your grocery list. The next, you're remembering something from childhood. The next, you're having a fantasy about someone you barely know. The mind is full of these vast spaces between thoughts, moments of blankness or confusion where you don't know what you're thinking about or why. Surrealist landscapes make those internal spaces visible. They give form to formlessness. And in doing so, they create a kind of beauty that's specific to confusion and uncertainty. A beauty of not knowing where you are or what comes next. We should probably acknowledge something that makes a lot of people uncomfortable about surrealism. It can be cruel. It can be ugly. It deliberately courts disgust and horror alongside wonder and beauty. There are images in surrealist art that are hard to look at, that seem designed to provoke and disturb rather than to enlighten or please. And this isn't accidental or incidental to the project. The surrealists believed that art had gotten too safe, too comfortable, too concerned with beauty in conventional terms. They wanted to shake people up, to force them to confront aspects of existence that polite society prefers to ignore. Death, decay, violence, sexuality in its more disturbing forms. All of this is fair game for surrealist imagery. There's an argument that this is necessary. The art that only shows us pretty things is lying to us about what life is really like. Life includes suffering and horror, alongside joy and beauty. The unconscious mind contains aggressive and destructive impulses, alongside creative and loving ones. To tell the truth about human experience, art has to be willing to go to dark places. But there's also an argument that surrealism sometimes wallows in darkness for its own sake, that it can be gratuitously shocking without having much to say beyond, "Look how shocking I am."
Some surrealist images feel more like adolescent provocation than genuine insight. There's a difference between confronting difficult truths and just trying to make people uncomfortable because you think it's edgy.
This tension has never really been resolved, and maybe it can't be. Art that pushes boundaries will always risk crossing into territory that's more offensive than illuminating. But the surrealists at least had the courage to risk it, to refuse to make art that was simply decorative or comforting. They believed art should do something, should change the viewer in some way, and sometimes that change is uncomfortable. Surrealism has this fascinating relationship with time. In many surrealist paintings, time seems to have stopped, or gotten stuck, or started flowing in multiple directions at once. You'll see clocks that are melting or broken. You'll see objects from different time periods coexisting in the same space. You'll see figures frozen mid-motion in a way that suggests eternal suspension rather than a captured moment. This temporal weirdness gets at something important about consciousness. The way we experience time in our minds doesn't match clock time. A moment of joy can feel timeless. A moment of pain can stretch on forever. In memory, events from decades ago can feel more vivid and present than what happened yesterday. The past keeps intruding into the present. The future casts shadows backward. Surrealism captures this subjective experience of time. It shows you a world where past, present, and future aren't separate categories, but are all mixed together. Where time pools and eddies instead of flowing in a straight line. And this feels true to how we actually live, doesn't it? We're never fully in the present moment. We're always haunted by the past and anxious about the future. We're time traveling in our heads constantly. Those melting clocks, they're not just a weird image. They're a statement about the fluidity of time, the way it bends under pressure, the way it's relative to the observer's state of mind. Time moves differently when you're bored versus when you're in danger. It speeds up as you get older. It stops during moments of trauma. The rigid mathematical measurement of time that clocks represent is a fiction. Or at least it's only one way of understanding duration and change. And there's something liberating in this realization. If time isn't as fixed as we think, if past and future are more flexible than we usually acknowledge, then maybe change is more possible than it seems. Maybe we're not as trapped in linear causality as we fear. Maybe the future hasn't been written yet, or if it has, maybe we can go back and revise the past. Not literally, but psychologically, through how we remember and reinterpret our experiences. So here we are, almost a century after Surrealism first emerged, and it's everywhere. It's in advertising, which learned that strange juxtapositions grab attention. It's in movies, where dream logic has become a standard tool for filmmakers. It's in video games, where impossible spaces and transforming objects are just part of the medium. It's in fashion, in music videos, in memes. Some would say this means Surrealism won. It successfully infiltrated mainstream culture and changed how we see things. Others would say it lost, that it's been domesticated and commodified, that surrealist techniques are now being used to sell products rather than to liberate consciousness, which is pretty much the opposite of what the original surrealists wanted. Both perspectives have some truth to them. Yes, surrealist imagery has been absorbed into commercial culture in ways that would probably horrify the movement's founders. When you use a melting clock to sell watches, you've kind of missed the point. But at the same time, the fact that surrealist images are now part of our visual vocabulary means that ideas that were once radical and disturbing are now just part of how we think. We're all a little bit surrealist now. We're all comfortable with a certain level of strangeness and discontinuity in our visual culture, and maybe that's the real legacy. Not specific images or techniques, but a way of seeing. Surrealism taught us to look for the cracks in reality, to notice when things don't quite add up, to trust our weird associations and irrational intuitions. It gave us permission to take dreams seriously. It suggested that the unconscious mind might have something important to tell us if we just listen. In a world that's increasingly surreal, in ways the original surrealists couldn't have imagined, where AI can generate images of anything, where virtual realities are becoming as compelling as physical ones, where the boundary between truth and fiction feels more unstable every day. Maybe surrealism has never been more relevant. Maybe we need that willingness to question what's real, to embrace ambiguity, to find meaning in strangeness. Surrealism never really ended. It couldn't end because it was never about a particular style or set of techniques. It was about a stance toward reality, a commitment to honouring the irrational and unconscious, alongside the rational and conscious. And that's a project that's never complete because the tension between these aspects of ourselves never resolves. We still live in a world that values logic and order above all else, that tries to quantify and systematize everything, that's uncomfortable with ambiguity and uncertainty. And we still have these minds that dream, that make strange associations, that want impossible things, that see faces in clouds and patterns in randomness. Surrealism is what happens when you take the mind seriously on its own terms, instead of trying to force it into rational categories. So yes, surrealism is a historical movement with a particular origin and development. But it's also something more than that. It's a permanent possibility in art and in consciousness. It's the recognition that beneath the surface of ordinary reality is something stranger and more wonderful and more terrible than we usually acknowledge. It's the commitment to exploring that strangeness rather than pretending it isn't there. Steaming Shiyin Mothman, and maybe that's what we need most from surrealism today. Not weird images for their own sake, but that fundamental attitude of openness to the irrational, to the unconscious, to the aspects of experience that don't fit neatly into our categories. In a world that's increasingly dominated by algorithms and data and rationalized systems, we need art that reminds us of everything that can't be calculated or predicted or controlled. We need dreams. We need the freedom to make unexpected connections. We need to remember that we're stranger than we think we are, that reality is weirder than it appears, that there are always more possibilities than the ones we've been told to see. That's surrealism, not just an art movement, but a way of staying human in an inhuman world, a way of keeping the door open to the unconscious, to dreams, to desires, to all the weird and wonderful and disturbing things that make us who we are beneath the surface. The dream is still unfolding.
Becoming a Surrealist, a guide to unlearning what you know.
The first lesson, forgetting how to draw.
Now that you understand what Surrealism is, you're probably wondering how you might create it yourself. And here's where things get interesting. Because the first thing you need to learn is how to unlearn. Everything you've been taught about making art, about planning your composition, about using references correctly, about making things look realistic, all of that beautiful technical knowledge needs to be gently set aside, at least temporarily. Not abandoned forever, mind you, but put in a drawer, where it can't interfere with what's trying to emerge from somewhere deeper. There's a quote that captures this perfectly. Learn the rules like a pro, so you can break them like an artist. The Surrealist understood that you can't meaningfully break conventions you don't understand. But they also understood that once you know the rules, holding onto them too tightly will strangle everything interesting before it has a chance to breathe. So the work of becoming a surrealist is this strange dance between knowing and not knowing, between control and surrender, between the trained hand and the untrained imagination. Think of it this way. When you were a child, before anyone taught you the right way to draw a house or a person, you just made marks on paper that felt true to you. A person might have been a circle with stick limbs. A house might have been bigger than the sun. None of it made logical sense, but all of it made emotional sense. That's the state of mind you're trying to get back to, but now with the benefit of adult consciousness and skill. You're trying to become a child who knows too much, or an expert who's willing to be stupid again. The Surrealists used to say that genius is childhood recovered at will. What they meant was that the creative state is one where you can access that childhood freedom, while also bringing adult capacities to bear on it. You're not trying to draw like a child. You're trying to draw with a child's courage and an adult's hand, conversing with your unconscious. So let's begin with the most fundamental surrealist practice, learning to have a conversation with your unconscious mind.
This sounds mystical, maybe even a bit ridiculous, but it's actually quite practical once you understand what's being asked of you. Your unconscious is not some mysterious entity living in a cave somewhere inside your skull. It's simply everything that's happening in your mind below the level of conscious awareness. All the connections forming, all the memories surfacing, all the associations blooming in the dark. The trick is to create conditions where the unconscious can speak without the conscious mind immediately jumping in to edit and control. One of the surrealists once said, "Pure psychic automatism, by which it is intended to express, whether verbally or in writing, the true function of thought. Thought dictated in the absence of all control exerted by reason, and outside all aesthetic or moral considerations." Now that's a mouthful, and it sounds almost clinical, but what it really means is, try to get your controlling, judging, rational mind to take a coffee break. Here's how you might begin. Sit down with a blank piece of paper and whatever drawing tool feels most natural to you. Not most impressive or most professional, most natural. Maybe that's a pencil, maybe it's a marker, maybe it's a crayon you found in a drawer. Now close your eyes for a moment and take a few breaths. Don't try to clear your mind because that's impossible, and also not the point. Instead, just notice what's already there. What images are floating through your awareness? What feelings are present? What random thoughts keep intruding? When you open your eyes, begin moving your hand across the paper without planning what you're going to draw. Let the line go where it wants to go. If your rational mind starts screaming, "But this looks stupid, this isn't going anywhere, this is meaningless," thank it politely for its input and keep going anyway. The rational mind is like a nervous passenger on a road trip who keeps asking if we're there yet and suggesting alternate routes. Acknowledge it, but don't let it grab the steering wheel. What often happens in these first attempts is that you'll draw for a while in this loose, spontaneous way, and then suddenly your conscious mind will recognize something in the marks you've made. "Oh, that looks like a face," or "that could be a bird." And the temptation is to then deliberately finish that face or bird in a conventional way. But here's where the real surrealist work begins. If you're going to develop what you've started, develop it in a way that stays true to the strange logic of how it emerged. If that face wants to melt into a landscape, let it melt. If that bird wants to have wheels instead of feet, give it wheels. Don't force it to make sense according to the rules of the waking world. The art of disruption. One of the most powerful surrealist techniques is the deliberate disruption of ordinary relationships between things. In the normal world, objects have certain uses and occupy certain contexts. A shoe goes on a foot, a telephone sits on a desk, a cloud floats in the sky. But what happens when you deliberately violate these expectations? What happens when you put the shoe where a head should be? When you make the telephone out of lobster parts? When you bring the cloud down into a living room? The surrealists discovered that these violations create a kind of cognitive friction that opens up new ways of seeing. There's a quote from one of them that goes, "Beautiful as the chance encounter of a sewing machine and an umbrella on an operating table." This bizarre statement actually contains the whole theory of surrealist juxtaposition. It's not just about putting random things together, it's about finding combinations that are logically impossible, but somehow emotionally or aesthetically right. The sewing machine and umbrella don't belong on an operating table, but there's something about that combination. The precision instruments, the drama of the operating theatre, the domesticity of the umbrella and sewing machine, that creates a peculiar poetry. So when you're creating surrealist work, you're looking for these kinds of charged juxtapositions. Not random combinations, but combinations that generate some kind of spark. The way to find them is through play and experimentation. Start with an ordinary object or situation, and then systematically ask yourself, what if this were made of something else? What if this were in a different location? What if this were combined with its opposite? What if this was scaled up or down dramatically? What if this were alive when it should be inanimate, or vice versa? Let's say you start with an egg. which is about as ordinary an object as you can imagine. Now begin the transformation. An egg that's as big as a building. An egg that's cracking open to reveal not a bird, but a city. An egg made of stone, impossibly heavy, resting on a bed of feathers. An egg that's also somehow a face, with the crack forming a melancholic mouth. You're not trying to be weird for weirdness' sake. You're trying to find the version of the egg that reveals something you couldn't see before. Something about fragility or potential or containment or emergence that the ordinary egg keeps hidden.
Mining your dreams.
Your dreams are perhaps the richest source of surrealist imagery you have access to, because dreams are already doing the work of disruption and transformation that you'd otherwise have to consciously create. The unconscious mind, unshackled from waking logic, produces imagery that's often more inventive than anything you could deliberately plan. So learning to work with your dreams becomes essential to developing a surrealist practice.
But here's the thing about dreams. They're slippery.
They evaporate almost instantly upon waking, leaving behind only fragments and feelings. So the first discipline is learning to catch them before they disappear. Keep something to write or draw with right next to your bed. The moment you wake, before you move or check your phone or think about your day, try to recall what you were just dreaming and write it down or sketch it out. Don't worry about making sense or being articulate. Just get something down while the memory is still fresh.
What you're recording doesn't need to be a complete narrative. In fact, the most useful dream material for surrealist work is often the fragments, the isolated images that stuck with you. The green door that opened onto a beach, the sensation of your teeth falling out like rain, the person whose face kept changing. These moments of intense strangeness are gold for surrealist creation because they already contain that quality of the uncanny, that feeling of being almost but not quite recognizable. Once you have this dream material collected, you can begin to work with it consciously. But here's the subtle part. You're not trying to literally illustrate your dreams, which often results in work that feels flat and meaningless to anyone but you. Instead, you're using the dream as a starting point for further exploration and transformation. Take that image of the green door opening onto a beach and ask, what else could happen here? What if the beach were made of pages from books? What if someone was standing in the doorway but they had no face or too many faces? What if the door were floating in space with no wall around it?
As one of the surrealists put it, I believe in the future resolution of these two states, dream and reality, which are seemingly so contradictory, into a kind of absolute reality, a surreality. You're not choosing between dream and waking reality. You're finding the place where they merge, where the logic of one infuses the other, creating something that couldn't exist in either realm alone.
The body knows. Here's something that might seem strange. Some of the best surrealist work comes not from thinking, but from moving. Your body has its own intelligence, its own way of knowing and creating that bypasses the rational mind entirely. When you're working in a truly automatic way, your hand might make marks or gestures that surprise you, that seem to come from somewhere other than conscious intention. This is the body knowing something before the mind catches up. Try this experiment. Put on music that has a strong emotional quality, but no words. Close your eyes. Begin moving your hand across a large piece of paper with a drawing tool, letting your hand respond to the music, rather than trying to draw anything in particular. Don't peek at what you're creating. Just feel the rhythm, the emotion, the energy of the music, and let your hand translate that into marks and gestures. The lines that emerge might be wild, chaotic, barely controlled, or they might be surprisingly precise and delicate. Either way, they're coming from a place deeper than thought. When you finally open your eyes and look at what you've created, you might see nothing but scribbles. Or you might see forms and figures that seem to have emerged accidentally. A face in the tangle of lines, a creature lurking in the negative space, a suggestion of landscape or architecture. And this is where conscious skill re-enters the process. You can now work with what the unconscious and the body have given you, elaborating and developing it, but always staying true to the strange logic of how it originated. The surrealist understood that the body is not separate from the mind, and that creativity flows through flesh and nerves and muscle as much as it flows through thought.
When you get too cerebral about making art, too locked in your head, you cut yourself off from this somatic intelligence. But when you let your body participate fully in the creative process, when you trust the hand to know things the brain doesn't, you open up channels of expression that are richer and stranger than anything purely mental could be. Accident as oracle, one of the most liberating realizations in surrealist practice, is that mistakes and accidents are not problems to be fixed but gifts to be accepted. That splash of paint that dripped where you didn't intend, that line that went in an unexpected direction, that color that mixed into something you didn't plan, these accidents are the universe offering you possibilities you wouldn't have thought of on your own. The rational mind hates accidents. It wants control, predictability, the satisfaction of executing a plan perfectly. But the surrealist mind loves accidents because they represent the intrusion of chance, of the unplanned, of what one artist called objective chance. The way the world seems to conspire to show you exactly what you needed to see, even though you didn't know you needed to see it. So when you're working and something goes wrong, instead of immediately trying to fix it or cover it up, stop and look at it carefully. What has this accident given you? Does that drip suggest a flow or transformation you hadn't considered? Does that misplaced line create a tension or relationship that's more interesting than what you had planned? Often the answer is yes, and the work becomes about following where the accident leads rather than forcing it back to your original intention. This requires a certain courage because it means giving up the illusion of control. It means being willing to follow a path you didn't choose, to end up somewhere you didn't plan to go. But this is precisely the space where surrealism lives, in the gap between intention and result, in the territory opened up when plans fail and something else emerges in their place. There's a story about one of the great surrealists who would prepare canvases in unusual ways, sometimes incorporating objects or textures before even beginning to paint, creating a surface that would respond unpredictably to whatever he applied to it. He wasn't trying to control every aspect of the work. He was setting up conditions for interesting accidents to happen, then collaborating with those accidents rather than fighting them. The alchemy of combination. Now let's talk about collage, because it's one of the most accessible and powerful surrealist techniques. Collage is about cutting elements from existing images and recombining them in new ways, creating impossible scenes and creatures through the simple act of putting together things that don't belong together. It's like playing God with magazine clippings, building new realities from the fragments of old ones. The beauty of collage is that you don't need to be able to draw or paint realistically to create compelling surrealist images. The camera has already done that work for you. What you're bringing to the process is vision, imagination, and a sense of what combinations will generate that surrealist spark. You're becoming a curator of the impossible, selecting and arranging fragments of reality into configurations that couldn't exist, but somehow should. Start collecting images that interest you without worrying too much about why they interest you. Old books, magazines, newspapers, your own photographs. Anything is fair game. You're building a visual vocabulary, a stockpile of raw material that your unconscious can draw from. Sometimes the images you're most drawn to collecting are the ones that will prove most useful later, even if you don't immediately know why. When you start combining these images, you're looking for what feels right rather than what makes sense. Does this Victorian woman's head belong on that bird's body? Does this architectural detail want to float in space, surrounded by clouds? Does this hand want to be holding a flower that's also somehow aflame? You're following intuition and association rather than logic. The question is never, does this make sense? The question is, does this make me feel something? Does it open up some new way of seeing? And here's a secret about surrealist collage. The more realistic and matter-of-fact the source images are, the more powerful the surrealist effect becomes. When you take photographs that look like they could be from a documentary or a news report and combine them into an impossible scene, the realistic quality of the parts makes the impossibility of the whole more unsettling and compelling. The brain can't quite dismiss it as obviously fake, so it has to grapple with the paradox. Excavating the symbol. Symbols are the language of the unconscious, and learning to recognize and work with personal symbols is crucial to developing meaningful, surrealist work. I'm not talking about universal symbols from dream dictionaries or textbooks. I'm talking about the images and objects that have peculiar resonance for you specifically, that keep showing up in your dreams and thoughts, that seem to carry more weight than they logically should. Maybe for you, it's doors or mirrors or birds or masks or water
or eyes. Maybe it's something more unusual. Typewriters, keys, clocks, eggs, roots, shells. These recurring motifs are your unconscious trying to tell you something, using the only language it knows. The work of surrealism is learning to speak this language back, to engage in dialogue with these symbols, rather than just experiencing them passively. When you identify a personal symbol, don't try to decode it rationally or look up what it means in some authoritative source. Instead, explore it through making work. Draw it repeatedly in different contexts and transformations. Combine it with other elements and see what emerges. Let it evolve and mutate. The meaning will reveal itself through the process of working with it, not through intellectual analysis. One artist spoke of trying to extract from nature's casket the secret of its gold, which is a typically surrealist way of saying that there are hidden treasures in our experience if we know how to look for them. Your personal symbols are that gold, the valuable ore that needs to be mined from the bedrock of your unconscious. The more you work with them, the richer they become, accumulating associations and resonances until they function as a kind of private mythology. But here's the paradox. While these symbols are personal, while they emerge from your specific history and psychology, when you use them in your work with honesty and depth, they often touch something universal. Other people recognize themselves in your private symbols because the unconscious speaks a language we all understand even if we don't know we're speaking it. Embracing the monstrous. Surrealism gives you permission to create beings and images that are disturbing, ugly, even grotesque. This isn't about trying to shock people for the sake of it. It's about acknowledging that the psyche contains not just beauty and light, but also shadow and strangeness. The monsters you create in surrealist work are often externalized versions of internal states: anxiety, desire, rage, confusion, fear, given form and face. When you create a creature with too many limbs, or a body that's merged with machinery, or a face that's melting or multiplying or hollowed out, you're making visible something that exists psychologically. These monstrous hybrids represent the parts of ourselves and our experience that don't fit into neat categories, that exceed boundaries, that refuse to be domesticated or made respectable. The key is to create these disturbing images not from a place of cruelty or nihilism, but from a place of honest exploration. As someone once said, there is no must in art because art is free. You're free to explore the dark and strange, because that's part of the human experience. Pretending it's not there, creating only pretty and palatable images, is a form of dishonesty. But also remember that even your monsters can have a peculiar beauty. The surrealists discovered that the grotesque and the beautiful aren't opposites, but often coexist in the same image. A creature that's disturbing in its strangeness might also be compelling in its form, might have an elegance to its impossibility. The goal isn't to simply disgust, but to create images that are complex enough to hold multiple contradictory responses at once. The space between. Pay attention to negative space, to absence, to what's not there. Surrealism is as much about emptiness as it is about presence. Those vast, barren landscapes with a single impossible object in them work because the emptiness itself becomes charged with meaning and atmosphere. The absence creates pressure, the void becomes a presence. When you're composing surrealist work, think about what you're leaving out as much as what you're including. Could this scene be more powerful if most of it were empty? Could this figure be more mysterious if half of it disappeared into shadow or void? Sometimes the most powerful gesture is the gesture toward nothing, the suggestion of something that isn't quite there. This connects to something fundamental about how surrealism works on the viewer. The images are often incomplete or ambiguous, full of gaps that the viewer's mind tries to fill in. You're not explaining everything or showing everything. You're creating openings, spaces for the viewer's unconscious to enter and participate. The viewer becomes a collaborator in creating meaning, bringing their own associations and interpretations to complete what you've left deliberately incomplete. Think of your surrealist work as a conversation rather than a lecture. You're not telling people what to think or feel. You're creating conditions for them to have their own encounter with the strange, their own experience of the uncanny. The gaps and silences and empty spaces are where that encounter happens. Time as material. Don't be afraid to work slowly, to let images develop over time, to leave work unfinished for days or weeks or months and come back to it. Surrealism isn't about instant gratification. It's about letting things ferment, allowing the unconscious time to process and transform what you've started. Sometimes the most important thing you can do with a piece of work is nothing. Put it away. Forget about it. Let it rest in the dark like a negative developing. When you come back to it later, you'll see it with fresh eyes. You'll notice possibilities you missed before. The unconscious will have been working on it even while your conscious mind was occupied with other things. This also applies to the process of learning surrealist techniques. You can't force yourself to access the unconscious on command. You can't schedule inspiration or plan to have meaningful dreams. What you can do is create regular practices that open the door and then be patient. Keep showing up. Keep making marks, keep collecting images. Keep paying attention to your dreams. Trust that the accumulation of all this attention and practice will eventually create conditions where something real can emerge. As one artist noted, the mind that opens to a new idea never returns to its original size. Learning to work as a surrealist expands your consciousness permanently. You start seeing the world differently. You notice juxtapositions and accidents and strange details that you would have overlooked before. The practice changes you, which changes what you can make, which changes you further. It's a spiral of transformation that has no end point, the permission to fail. Here's perhaps the most important lesson. Most of what you create in pursuit of surrealism will not be good. It will be silly, obvious, forced, meaningless. And that's not just okay, it's necessary. You have to make a lot of failures to create the conditions where something genuine can emerge. You have to be willing to look stupid, to waste time and materials, to pursue ideas that lead nowhere. The rational mind hates this. It wants efficiency, progress, measurable results. But creativity, especially surrealist creativity, doesn't work that way. It works through abundance and waste, through making far more than you'll ever use or show, through following paths that turn out to be dead ends. Every failed experiment teaches you something. Every silly image you create loosens the grip of self-consciousness a little more. So give yourself permission to be bad at this. Give yourself permission to make embarrassing, pretentious, obvious surrealist images. Make the trite combinations. Make the heavy-handed symbols. Make the images that try too hard to be weird. Get all of that out of your system so that eventually, without trying, something authentic can emerge. The paradox is that the less you care about making good surrealist art, the more likely you are to actually make something worthwhile. When you stop performing surrealism and start living it, when you stop trying to make impressive images and start genuinely exploring your unconscious, that's when the real work begins. The practice of attention. Ultimately, becoming a surrealist is less about learning techniques and more about developing a way of paying attention to the world and to yourself. It's about noticing when something feels strange or charged or significant, even if you don't know why. It's about trusting your irrational responses. It's about being willing to pursue connections and associations that don't make logical sense. This kind of attention can become a way of life, not just a way of making art. You start moving through the world as a surrealist, noticing the ways reality is already surreal if you know how to look. The strange things people say, the odd juxtapositions created by advertising and architecture, the way shadows fall, the dreams that seep into waking life. All of this becomes material, becomes part of your ongoing dialogue with the unconscious. And the work you make from this place of sustained attention will have a different quality than work that's merely trying to look surreal. It will have authenticity, necessity, urgency. It will be surrealist not because it imitates surrealist techniques, but because it genuinely emerges from that deeper place where consciousness and unconsciousness meet, where reality and dream merge, where the self discovers it's stranger than it thought it was. So begin. Begin with automatic drawing. Begin with collecting images for collage. Begin with recording your dreams. Begin with looking at the world as if you've never seen it before. Begin with being willing to not know what you're doing. Begin with the courage to make bad art in pursuit of something real. The unconscious is waiting. It's been waiting your whole life. It has things to show you that you can't imagine yet. All you have to do is create the conditions for it to speak, and then have the courage to listen to what it says, even when, especially when, what it says makes no sense at all. That's surrealism. Not a style, but a relationship. Not a technique, but a way of being. Not something you learn, but something you become. Now go create your beautiful nightmares.